My name is Peter Breslin, and I'm just going to be talking about connections between conservation and cultivation. My background is in uh, the hobby. That's how I started with my love for cacti and succulents from the age of about 10, which now is, ancient times of dial phones and no internet and, all that. But I was a grower first, and it was after years and years of growing that I became interested in habitat and photography, and then that led naturally kind of to doing the PhD. So I came at the academic research from a somewhat of an unusual angle, which is from a cultivation angle. And so this is an attempt to kind of connect the two. um, and advance the slide here. So first, just a quick overview of plant conservation biology. What do plant conservation biologists actually do? They do a lot of population studies to try to understand the viability of populations of plants. What are the trends? Are they increasing? Are they steady? Are they declining? Understanding where plants grow and why, understanding the factors that contribute to extinction risk, and then coming up with actual, structured plans to try to prevent extinction. And all of that is connected to field work and data. So it's very quantitative science at this point. Some of the more recent work from 2015, Getch et al. In Nature Plants did a massive assessment of the cactus family, found that about 30% of all of the taxa in Cactaceae are at risk of extinction over the next century or so. Their study focused on overlapping data of biodiversity and threat. So on the left, this is a proportional map of the species and their location, geospatial location, that are considered at risk. And on the right is the map of the species diversity. And you can see there's a real strong correlation, of course. And they broke down the threats to the cactus family. And again, this is entirely limited to Cactaceae. And I'm sure that the picture for various other succulent families is, in many cases, quite similar. But they broke it down by residential commercial development, biological use of different kinds, and agricultural. And you can see that the colors kind of distribute, and where the white areas are is where all three threats are in operation. So that's just an overview. I'm going to be focusing mostly on this region up here today, just to give some focus. And these are areas that I've actually visited and I'm familiar with. You can apply all the different ways of thinking about habitat and cultivation to really any region in the world. It depends on what you're growing and how you're trying to grow it. And you can see up here in this region, just sort of color coded, really Baja California plus our desert regions in the United States. The main threat is this blue, which is residential and commercial development, and that's habitat loss caused by those factors. So one thing that study did not cover is illegal poaching and extraction, of cacti for the commercial trade, and that is a huge factor. And they acknowledge in that paper that they don't really address that. But anyway, so what makes a rare plant species rare and maybe at risk of extinction? Definitely climate, adaptation to usually a narrow climate niche. Edaphic soil preferences, which you're going to hear me talk about a little bit more later. This is an adaptation to a particular soil chemical profile. So maybe limestone, decomposed granite, serpentine, my study species for the PhD, Cochinia haley is serpentine adapted, which is wild. And also soil texture, habitat preferences that are difficult to reproduce, like in a geographical way in your cultivation, slope angle, aspect. Some of these plants are very particular about the slope angle and aspect Now, this next one is an interesting area that growers are starting to try to kind of reproduce in the pot or even in the ground, and that's possible mycorrhizal or even endophytic bacterial associations that are happening where the roots meet the dirt. And I don't know who's doing this with cacti and succulents. Maybe in the Q&A we could talk about that a little bit more, but I am convinced that it drives a lot of very tricky plants, that are difficult in cultivation. In habitat, they have these wild symbiotic things going on in the root zone. Of course, rare plants arise because of habitat fragmentation, destruction, and poaching. And then the last one, just quite simply, a lot of rare plants just are intrinsically sort of stuck. Like maybe they have low fitness, there's inbreeding depression, low reproduction, maybe the pollinators that disappeared, so there's all kinds of reasons. Here's an example of a rare plant, Echinocerius arizonicus. This is a federally listed endangered species. You could see here that the main root is extending all the way back to this little tiny pocket of maybe tiny bit of organic matter between these rocks. And what it shows is that a lot of rare plants are actually super tough. This is a very tough plant when it's in its habitat. And that's something to keep in mind, that, if we can find ways to work with these plants in cultivation, then sometimes we're quite successful. And the Desert Botanical Garden actually has the XC2, that is out of habitat, reference collection of these. And they do great in cultivation for the most part. So it's an interesting thing. So what makes a plant difficult in cultivation? Climate, soil texture, habitat. Maybe there's some mycorrhizal or endophytic bacterial associations. Does that look familiar? Well, it's essentially the same list. So a lot of the time, difficulties in cultivation arise because the plants are difficult. I mean, that sounds like a very silly thing to say, but that's the deal. And my goal today is to talk about why those connections might be useful for people to make. So here's Echinoplastis erectocentris. This is an Arizona endemic, very restricted and narrow distributions for this plant. And you hear anecdotally that these are very difficult in cultivation. And they are. I mean, they're very slow growing in cultivation, and they rot, and they're very difficult to raise to flowering size for many growers, even in their or close to their natural habitat. Not always, but often. Here's some flowers. The reason I put these pictures in is just to kind of show why people want to grow these plants. Why do people want to grow rare plants? I mean, I think there's a motivation just by the rarity. There's a kind of fascination because you have something in your garden or in your greenhouse that's rare, and you can say, look at this, it's a very rare species. But a lot of these very difficult, challenging, rare plants are beautiful too. They're gorgeous flowers or spines, or they have some unique qualities. And I think it's true in the succulent world quite a bit also, not just Cactaceae. So the question, how to improve the odds? How can we maybe just get that little edge in the positive direction of raising some of these plants, for example, from seed to flowering size? So one of the ways that I actually use myself, especially after I started studying a lot more habitat data, I wanted to know the climate. I wanted to know the soil, pH texture, the mineralogy. I wanted to know the precipitation and temperature cycles, the landscape scale conditions where the species grows. Is it on slopes only? Is it on ridge tops? Is it in the basins? Does it grow in silt? Or, what's the deal? And so I started to collect as much data as I could around this. Now, it's very important to point out here up front, it is not necessary to recreate habitat conditions. Okay, that is very fortunate. There's a ton of our favorite plants, rare as they may be, that will grow beautifully under your conditions. And you don't even have to do any of this dance that I'm going to go through today to get them to grow, from seed to flowering size. You're going to have success. Even in really weird little microclimates that you create, some of these rare plants will do great. So that's the good news. You know, it's not necessary to recreate habitat. If we had to, we'd really be in big trouble. But if you're stuck on something, and if there's something that just won't work for you, one approach might be, well, check out where it's from, what happens to it in the wild. So I'm going to profile some difficult species. Maybe they're not difficult for you. And some of these were difficult for me, especially in Phoenix, Arizona, where I used to live. I am limiting myself to large desert ecoregions that I've actually camped in, that I'm familiar with for years. You know, if your local conditions are more similar, then you're not going to have these problems. And then each profiled species is either federally listed, actually officially, you know, as endangered, at risk of extinction, or is quite rare and maybe should be listed, or at least, you know, on someone's radar. So the case studies that I'm going to do: the Arizona mountains, Colorado Plateau, all the Pediocacti up there is what I'm going to just sort of talk about. The Mojave Desert with Sclerocactus polyancistris, the Chihuahuan Desert region with a couple of narrowly restricted endemics from that region, and the California chaparral and Baja Pacific coast with Cochimia maritima and Dudley epacophytum. And, you know, Dudley epacophytum is a great example of a very narrowly distributed, highly desirable, often poached, illegally collected succulent that grows in a really unusual, interesting kind of habitat. But in this region, Los Angeles, San Diego, the whole California coastal region up, you know, north, Dudley epacophytum is, I'm told, very easy to grow. So that's a great example, right, of what we're going to kind of be looking at. Here's some images, upper left, going clockwise. That's Pediocactus peeblesianus, subspecies Ficcae zeniorum, which I think has the largest plant name to size ratio in the plant family, or at least one of them. Then we have Sclerocactus polyancistris. People love to grow this plant for both the spines and the flowers. And here, Coryphantha robinsorum, federally listed. Cochimia maritima, very narrow distribution. Dudley epacophytum, gorgeous, and Cistrocactus pallidus in the sort of near the Big Bend region of Texas. So what are you looking for? If you're really struggling with a plant, the very first thing to find out is where it's from. I see a lot of cultivation questions on Facebook and in other groups. How can I grow this plant? The one thing that you really want to do is just Google, get up there and find out where it's from, and then get any kind of climate, soil, seasonal cycles, geography, and any other habitat information you can. Now, that won't necessarily give you a solution, but at least it's a start. So I often mention that to people who have questions. How do I grow such and such species of aloe, or, you know, whatever it might be? Where's it from? You know, basic question. So it's just making that connection to habitat. So there's tons of data that's available online. It's all public, it's all free, and we're going to be using a bunch of it. Now, I get really technical with it because I got a PhD, right? So you don't have to do that, though. I mean, I'm going to make that clear as I go on. And then the last two are really important. When possible, visit cacti and succulents in habitat. Get out there. And Stephen Brack has some feedback later that I incorporated in here about camping with the plants. So I don't know if that's how you roll, but it does provide incredible information to actually sleep where the plants live, believe it or not. So we'll talk about that later. Talk with other growers. You know, there's a lot of expertise these days, and it's all available. Everybody has stuff they want to tell you. Now, you know, one thing that'll happen, of course, is you'll get like 100 different suggestions. So connect it back to the knowledge you already have. Okay, so one of the data sources is this internet resource called soilgrids.org. And you can get, this is a zoom in on just, you know, North America, but you can get any kind of soil information you would want from any location on Earth from soilgrids.org. And this is just an example of one of the variables they have for free, you know, available online. And that's the level of soil organic carbon, which is a measure of the kind of organic matter or nature of the soil. And you can see very clearly, right, that the regions that I'm going to be talking about today, the Chihuahuan Desert, the Colorado Plateau, the Mojave, and Baja California, these are among the lowest soil organic carbon areas in the world. If you zoom out to the entire Earth, you would see this if you go to soil grids. So you can get pH, you can get texture, you can get chemical composition, you can get all kinds of information from this website. And it's just interactive. You don't have to download anything, and it can be very useful. And then the climate information that I'm going to be using today is from WorldClim 2.0, which is a free, incredible data source of all of these 19 climate variables for any location on the entire globe. These are interpolated from actual data, and these are the first, you can see the first 11 are temperature, and the last 8, are precipitation. And it's pretty high, a lot of data. And making sense of it can be challenging sometimes, but it is very useful. I use this data set to do species distribution modeling for the PhD dissertation. So another source of great information is Data Basin. If you just Google Data Basin, it will take you there. And this World Wildlife Fund, terrestrial ecoregions of the world. And this is level 3. It's showing these different ecoregions. The ecoregions are often defined by plant species. So it's especially helpful. It's not always defined that way, but often. And you can see the really kind of cool resolution of all these different ecoregions. Here's the Chihuahuan Desert. Here's the Colorado Plateau, the Mojave Desert, the Sonoran Desert, the 2 different kind of parts of Baja California, and then the Cape region, et cetera. So working with this data set of the ecoregions, you can get some really interesting information that might be helpful. So we're going to start with the Arizona Mountains, Colorado Plateau, and we'll talk a little bit about Pediocactus species, which for some growers, especially out of habitat conditions, are very challenging. And this is just an ecoregion map. If you take that ecoregion out, you have Arizona Mountains, you have Colorado Plateau. Boom. Now, these are, this is only 12 of the climate variables of the 19 that are available at WorldClim. Working with this data can be very tricky. It's very high data. I mean, it's huge. These are huge files that you then crop to the area you're interested in. You can get a lot of this information just from searching weather for a particular location. I heard from David Rubo from Arezzo, Italy, with some advice. And David, you can look up Arezzo, Italy, and get a lot of this info without being as technical as this. But okay, so this is the ecoregion, right, of the Arizona mountain forests and the Colorado Plateau. And you can see some patterns. It's very cold, for example. The minimum temperature of the coldest month is 5 degrees Celsius down here in the southern part of the ecoregion, and way colder, -20, up at the higher elevations. You can see precipitation. You can see the seasonality of the precipitation, which is how much does the precipitation change depending on summer or winter, the warmest versus the coldest quarter. So there's all kinds of very detailed info that a plant conservation biologist would use to help understand the habitat. So I'm just going to select some out. You can see from annual mean temperature that a large portion of this ecoregion, which is, again, the Arizona-Colorado kind of interface, is quite cool, which is no big surprise, right? And then for those of you who remember that, hopefully I don't cause any panic or like anxiety attacks or anything, but these are box plots. And good old John W. Tukey, who came up with the whole box plot idea when he was doing data stuff back in the 70s. You have the extreme values on either side and then some outliers. And the box itself, right, is the first quartile, the median, and the third quartile. And that just gives you kind of the range of most of the values here. And you can see that with this box plot, we're talking about 6 to about 14 degrees Celsius as the annual mean. So down here, we're looking at an average of about 50 degrees. So you're talking about basically inside your refrigerator, okay? Or maybe a little warmer. Mean temperature of the coldest quarter, you can see it's cold. Precipitation of the wettest quarter is relatively low, but there's some really high variation in pockets of the habitat. But where you're going to find most of the pedios, we're talking very low precipitation. And this is the wettest time of the year. And these are in millimeters. And then precipitation of the coldest quarter, you can see that in some regions of the ecoregion, the coldest quarter is when they get the most precipitation. And that's at higher elevations. On the other hand, at the lower elevations, you can see that the winter is relatively dry. So that's very important info probably, right? So when you go to soil grids, you see that the soil is high pH, and that is remarkable, 8.2 to about 9 pH. That is really pretty alkaline, okay? The technical name for most of these soils, calcisols and regosols, high lime, very low weathering, rocky, in other words, and a lot of silt and sand. High in coarse fragments and a highly heterogeneous geography. This base map shows just the incredible features, right? That, as you can imagine, the geographic features of the Arizona forests and Colorado Plateau, with our great Grand Canyon through here, and all of the different Pediocacti kind of in this region, many species. And I'm not referring here to Pediocactus simpsonii, but the weird Pediocacti that are federally listed. So what does this all do to help if you wanted to grow Pediocactus, right? Well, try, okay, an alkaline mix, coarse fragments, very quick draining, really be easy on the water year round. Try a distinct winter dry period. Keep cool, not you, but the plants, even during the growing season. High ultraviolet light. I didn't show any of that ultraviolet data. You can also get that from the shuttle. The space shuttle took a bunch of ultraviolet light readings, and that data is available for free from NASA. And it's really high in ultraviolet light in this ecoregion, as you can imagine. The growing season is very short. You cannot force Pediocactus to grow, and you cannot make them go dormant either. They have a mind of their own. So you have to watch carefully to see what they're doing. And then if you're growing from seed, it seems like sulfuric acid wash or some other method of chipping that incredibly tough seed coat. I know that Mesa Garden and Stephen Brack used to recommend several seasons of freezing and thawing, outside, which you can replicate to some degree with a freezer. And so here's some of these plants. And I hope to show here why people love these plants. Pediocactus peeblesianus, subspecies Ficizenniorum, Pediocactus paradini, which grows very close, but completely different habitat. You can see the rough soil here. Here's another example with the legs of the tripod to give a little bit of scale, how tiny a lot of these plants are. And that's another close-up of Ficizenniorum from the House Rock Valley in Arizona. And there's Pediocactus bradii, which is also federally listed at Marble Canyon and growing in just chips of, quartz. And that's their preferred habitat. And these large features here are the fruit, typical Pediocactus fruit. So hopefully some of that climate info might be helpful. How do you replicate that? Of course, that would become very individualized for different growers. All right, so moving along. So we were looking at this ecoregion here. We're going to move over here to the Mojave. And that's what the Mojave Desert ecoregion, as defined, very specifically looks like when you take it out of this context. And we're going to be talking about a plant that poses great difficulties for a lot of growers who I've spoken with, Sclerocactus polyancestris. Here is a map of occurrences. And you can see from this occurrence map some strange features. One is that there's a ton of populations up in the Panamint Range, very close to Death Valley. And these are mountain populations. You have these extremes here, and then down here. This is like a disjunct distribution where you have, and down here in these low elevations around Barstow and really very hot and relatively barren, you will find individual plants that are quite separated from each other. There are very few actual dense or significant populations that I've found in this area. On the other hand, way up here in the mountains at almost 7,000 feet, looking down on the hottest place on Earth, at least in North America, or the lowest, you find populations of 40 to 50 individuals within about a 1 or 2 square kilometers. So we'll talk about that. That is an example of finding the location if you can. So what's the annual mean temperature? You might guess it's hot. Okay. The maximum temperature, the warmest month, hot. You can see right here is Death Valley. Okay. That's the feature that is the darkest green on here. We're talking about an annual or maximum rather of 45 or above Celsius, which is, you know, almost 120, 123 even, or whatever, way up there. And then notice that just adjacent to that region, right, is the Panamint Range with these much cooler temperatures where a great many Sclerocactus polyancestris live at 7,000 feet. The annual range is very significant, and that's important to keep in mind. A lot of these challenging plants in cultivation require extreme heat and extreme cold, sometimes in the same day. I think Buck was talking about, you know, that it's summer at night, summer during the day and winter at night. And that is true for a lot of these challenging cacti and probably succulents from these kinds of habitats around the world. And then you can see that the mean temperature of the coldest quarter is quite cold. So we're talking about a hot and cold environment, right? It's got that. And then add into that the fact that annual precipitation for this region is low, okay? I mean, we are talking really low. And, if you're looking at Death Valley, again, this feature here, right next to it, the Panamints, you can see there's a significant difference, however, right? I mean, even though it's only about 400 millimeters a year, it's really different from less than 100 millimeters a year, okay? So keep that in mind. The wettest quarter and the coldest quarter are identical. So that should tell you something very important. The Mojave Desert generally has a wet winter and a dry summer, with the exception, of course, of thunderstorms. How much of that water is actually available is another question. You know, when you have a big thunderstorm and all that water dries out, who knows how much of it is actually soaked up. Here's some box plots to just kind of show the spread of all this different data. And one thing to notice is that precipitation of the wettest quarter, there are a bunch of outliers. And what this indicates is that the habitat sometimes gets a lot wetter depending on the winter. And we know those winter precipitation cycles are very important for a lot of these challenging plants. So we're looking at hardly any organic material in the soil, high sand, a high pH, rocky, not very highly weathered, basins, mesas, and mountainous terrain. So it's really heterogeneous. Here's a nice topographic map showing Death Valley, the Panamints, and it's up here where these larger populations of polyancestris are found. And then oddly, the individuals found way down here in the basin. So why is it challenging? Well, I think it's pretty clear. Extremes of temperature, very low precipitation, low water availability, hot and dry. This next one, very challenging to replicate in cultivation. A cool or cold dormancy coinciding with the wettest season. Extremely poor soil, mountainous microclimate might be the preferred habitat. So here are some of these plants up in the mountains at 7,000 feet. You can see the poor soil quality clearly. Here is a shot of one with snow, and this was in the springtime. These are still dormant, but they also flower very close to when there's snow on the ground. So this is up in the mountains now, of course. And they have beautiful flowers, spines. You can see why people are attracted to growing these. Very close by down in the basin is Echinopsis johnsonii, which can also be quite challenging. You can see the rough conditions that these plants absolutely thrive in. So now the more xeric habitat down around Barstow, hardly any vegetative cover whatsoever. Here's a lone plant living up to its common name as the hermit cactus. very old, very large, but there's no other plants anywhere. There's hardly even any other cacti. This is near Helendale, California, an old individual with beautiful spines. And just to show you how low water the habitat is, take a look at this variety of Echinocerius engelmannii. Really incredible spines. You know, whenever you see spines like this, you're looking at very low water, right? Because they're going to exert all that energy to keep the herbivores away. Now, if you have trouble growing Sclerocactus polyancestris, you could maybe try bottle trees. This is Elmer's Bottle Tree Ranch in Helendale or near Helendale. And I'm sure these are a lot easier to grow than Sclerocactus. Anyway, moving right along, we're going to talk a little bit about the Chihuahuan Desert now, down here. Huge desert region. And that's what it looks like when you pull it out of the map. And this desert region in general is home to a whole series of highly restricted endemic species, succulents and cacti. And usually these plants have a narrow geographical distribution. They're not found outside of a particular soil type, which suggests that they are edaphically adapted to that soil. They're very small populations. Coryphantha robinsorum is federally listed, and Cistrocactus pallidus is probably very rare over its range. It's hard to find, for one thing. And they're abundant when you find them, though, which is a weird pattern for a lot of these endemics. You find them, there's a bunch of them. So what's the climate? Well, the annual mean, as you can imagine, is warm. It's not as warm as the Mojave. The mean temperature of the driest quarter is low. It's relatively cool, okay? The precipitation of the warmest quarter and the coldest quarter are distinctly different. Now, these shades are not, they don't look very different, but keep in mind that the scale is different on these scale bars. This one goes up to 700 millimeters. This only goes up to about 250. And you can see that the wet season in the Chihuahuan is the summer, and the winters for much of the Chihuahuan Desert region are bone dry. And that is a huge factor in cultivation. If you ask anybody who loves to grow Chihuahuan Desert plants. So the soil, high limestone, low to hardly any organic, high sand and silt. Again, high pH, poor soil, okay? And here's a topographic map. You can see that the Chihuahuan Desert is really quite diverse in its physical geography. No surprise, right? So what makes them challenging? One thing that is not captured in some of the data I showed is that there's a distinct thermo period. That is a fancy term for, again, summer during the day and winter at night, or at least cool. And that can be very challenging to replicate depending on where you live, right? I have known people who grow Chihuahuan Desert plants in the Phoenix area who use air conditioning overnight to try to recreate this thermo period, okay? Another one that's really important, I always got the best results for Chihuahuan Desert cacti from a cold, dry winter dormancy. Alkaline, rocky potting soil really works best for me. I know there's a lot of controversy around using peat or not still, which has been a discussion that's been going on for decades, thanks to Ralph Peters and others. And then a really interesting thing about some of these, and Cistrocactus in particular, they're early bloomers and they'll show buds without being watered. So you take a look at your plants and all of a sudden they have buds on them and you haven't watered them at all. You've been keeping them dry over the winter. And I think some growers make the mistake of watering at that point to try to force those buds or to help the plant out. And I've had many actually rot during that dry spring because I watered them because I lacked discipline. So Coryphantha robinsorum looking great in its jagged limestone right on the Mexican border habitat in the Chihuahuan Desert of Arizona, which is a weird thing. It's at least a transition. And it's a gorgeous little plant, nice flowers, and grows very low to the ground, totally exposed. And then Ancistrocactus brevihemata subspecies pallidus, cute little thing near the Big Bend. You can see from these pictures the rough conditions they grow in. Other plants that grow in these kinds of weird little niches that are weird in cultivation, like Echinocerius divicii or, Viridiflorus. divicei. These things get huge in cultivation and they love being grown from seed and they do great. When you try to find them in habitat, good luck, right? Mammillaria lazy-acantha, usually pretty forgiving in cultivation. More difficult, Echinopsis mariposensis. I think some definite adjustments need to be made for that federally listed endangered species. This one also federally listed endangered on the hot desert floor of the Big Bend region. And these to me seem like they're adapted to much cooler climates. And they just sort of are hanging on since it seems like the cool went away thousands of years ago in the Ice Age, the last glacial maximum. These just give me the impression, I have no actual data to support that, but they seem like a relic population that probably is adapted to cooler conditions. So that's an interesting pattern in the Cactaceae of Chihuahua, especially. All right, so some quick notes on the Sonoran Desert. We're not going to spotlight anybody from there, but it's, obviously it's warm. The temperature of the coldest quarter is pretty warm. So it's a warmer desert. The precipitation of the wettest quarter, relatively low, with the exception of these mountainous areas. And the precipitation of the coldest quarter, pretty high. And again, like the Mojave, well, here's the topographic map. And you can see the Sonoran has physical geography quite different from either the Mojave or any of the other ecoregions we've looked at. It's low, it's basins, it's a lot of sand, and then it's a different kind of habitat. And the soil is low organic, high sand, high pH, the same kind of soils that are found all over this region. Generally lower elevation, a lot of basins. And the key difference, now this is something I often talk about with people who are having trouble with cacti in particular. The precipitation of the coldest quarter here is the Sonoran. Here is the Chihuahuan. So winter rains are a huge driving force in the biodiversity of the Sonoran Desert, and summer rains. The Sonoran is unique in North American deserts in having a bi-seasonal rain pattern. Heavy summer, heavy winter. The Chihuahuan Desert, not quite the same. Very, low water in general, but low in the summer and very low in the winter. So cold, dry winter. Okay, that's a little comparison of Sonora and Chihuahua. Now moving on to the last place we're going to look at. We're looking at the California chaparral, which is the coastal sage of chaparral is the blue, and then the Baja California desert, which you can break down at level 4 to, I think, 3 different ecoregions. We're looking in particular at Cañón San Andres, which is right here on the coast. If you look back at our map, it's basically here. And Isla Cedros, this island here, out here. And Punta Norte, which is where, so this area is where Dudley epacophytum grows. That's it. And you have to hike all the way up in the mountains to see it. So take a look at the mean annual is warm. It's a pretty warm region. And even in the coldest quarter of the year, it's pretty warm. And that's important to understand. We're moving to a kind of subtropical region at this point, more like Sinaloa or southern Sonora, right? The annual precipitation is pretty low. And especially in the region we're looking at, look at that. It's extremely low precipitation. And something that's often been pointed out, people say, well, I have this plant from Baja California, how do I grow it? Well, it depends to some degree. Here's the winter rain, Sonoran Desert pattern. And here is the summer rain, subtropical pattern. And so you see that there's quite a distinct difference, right, between northern Baja California and the south. So that even knowing to that level where something is from. The Baja California Peninsula is famous for its physical geography. It's really incredibly varied. Again, we're looking at these little seat canyons along here and Isla Cedros. So how are these plants getting water? This is Cañón de San Andres in Baja California. It's the type locality of Cochinea maritima. And according to Webb and Turner in the journal in 2015, it's the habitat of 26 or more species of cacti and succulents. And we saw from our map that coldest or warmest, it's dry, right? However, it's not dry, right? We know this. Isla Cedros is very similar. So what's going on? Fog and condensation. And Webb and Turner's article is great. Check it out in the journal from 2015. Cactus and succulent biodiversity is strongly correlated with fog. And Jose Delgadillo and Dr. Sula van der Planck did a great study on the way that fog drives the phenology or flowering time of cacti and succulents in the California chaparral, the California floristic province. I recommend that one too. And one frustrating thing is that currently, as far as I know, maybe I'm ignorant of something, it wouldn't be the first time, global data sets that quantify fog, especially translated to available water in the soil, are very hard to come by or non-existent. So that would be a huge contribution actually to understanding plant distributions. So this is what the Vizcaíno Desert looks like when it's foggy. It's super foggy. And a lot of plants grow there: Phaerocactus fortii, Phaerocactus peninsulae, Phaerocactus gracilla subspecies coloratus, which the type locality coincides with the type locality of Cochimia maritima in San Andres Canyon. Amazing, amazing plants. Look at all those spines. Again, that gives you the sense of how low water the habitat is. When you invest that much energy into that kind of armament, and then peninsulae subspecies viscainensis, straight out of camera, no color adjustment on that. Incredible spines, grandiflorus, all these huge barrel cacti. And they're getting, subspecies Hancockii for Cainocereus maritimus. So Santa Rosalita is kind of the center of this particular habitat. Cool little chapel there, a little art museum. I recommend visiting there. It's a very nice little village. Cochimia maritima grows in the canyon. It grows on rocks. This canyon is surrounded by flat, sandy areas, so it's a really distinct physical geography. These flowers are from the winter. So, you're seeing winter flowering patterns, very poor conditions that it grows in. It's adapted that way. Gorgeous flowers. And then some other plants that grow in the general area: Grussonia robertsii, Cochimia blasfeldiana. Now, when you see another indicator, proxy for fog desert, when you see these tillandsia growing on cacti, you know that there's some fog, right? So when you fly over to Isla Cedros, you can see Cochimia pondii, Goodrichii, blasfeldiana subspecies rectispina, Phaerocactus chrysocanthus. Huge diversity on Cedros. Check out these phaerocacti growing on the high ridge top, covered with pine needles from the indigenous pine, the endemic pine that grows there. And there's a picture with the pine up on the ridge tops. This is where you find Dudley epacophytum. And they're gorgeous succulents. You can understand why people like to grow these or have them around. Highly sort of sculpted, very succulent, chalky. They capture everything people love about Dudley, right? Well, where they grow is on these windward facing, ocean facing, sort of more southern or western facing slopes. You can see the pine growing perfectly well on there. And on this side is the xeric vegetation. Here's a better, more close picture. That's Agave sebastiana, the opuntia that lives on Cedros that is a bit of a mystery. It might be littoralis or related, right? Probably is. All the phaerocacti, and then on the right side is all the pines. And you can see the fog over here. So I think this is very strong evidence, right? That the fog is really driving these plant distributions. So to grow plants from this particular region, I think high humidity, fogging them, spraying them, that kind of humidity can actually be helpful for a lot of cacti, depending on, where they grow. So I asked a bunch of expert growers what they thought about this whole topic. Now, I'm not going to, I don't have time to read, I'm not going to read the slides, so don't freak out. I am going to just kind of summarize what they said. I hope they don't feel I paraphrase them incorrectly. So the very first one is Stephen Brack, somebody I've admired as a grower for decades. And his recommendation is to camp with the cacti. And his observation in South Africa, for example, was that he would wake up, everything would be covered with moisture, frost, heavy dew. And this would be during seasons when there was no rain, right? And this would provide, in his observation, a small but steady source of water during the growing season. So, and a lot of that has to do with dew point and thermoperiodicity, right? The dew point is going to be a higher temperature. You'll get more dew when you have more of a distinct separation, right, between day and night temperatures. So I think a lot of our plants grow under those conditions. So rough camping with no tent, which I don't do. But here's some pictures of where I have camped: Las Plaitas, north of Todos Santos, Punta Norte on Isla Cedros. We didn't just visit for a day, we stayed for a few days. Isla Magdalena in Baja California Sur, which blasted out, destroyed fishing village buildings. Sierra La Laguna in BCS, the Vermilion Cliffs, Marble Canyon. You have to get a permit from the Navajo Nation to camp out there. Big Bend Ranch State Park, Big Bend National Park, Death Valley with my office in my car there, finishing my PhD dissertation. The reason I'm hiding out in the car with the nice seat warmer is it was 26 degrees Fahrenheit that morning. So, and then Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument. So Jeffrey Lee Moore of Arid Adaptations Nursery in Tucson uses cultivation habitat info a lot, but his great caveat is to also kind of assess your local conditions and try to combine that information into a workable system. Rob Romero, who's an expert grower of really difficult plants to grow, originally or earlier from Albuquerque, now in Tucson. One of his main areas of focus here is soil, okay? Wets evenly and dries quickly. And try to be easy on the water. And Rob recommends actually acidifying the water, but not very much. 1 ounce of white vinegar per 5 gallons of water. Andy Sikinen has noticed that Hectia are often edaphic endemics. They're restricted by soil, but actually in cultivation, they're really flexible. So there's a bit of a mystery there, right? Maybe they just outcompete other plant species on substrates that those species won't grow on in habitat, but they really love, being grown however you want in a lot of ways in cultivation. Of course, Andy lives in the San Diego area where a lot of plants I have noticed that people find challenging from more subtropical climates or coastal fog kind of climates are actually really pretty, they grow like crazy in San Diego. So that's a lucky thing. Now, I contacted a couple guys from Italy who I admire as growers. Bruno Magnani from Rome. He grows on his balcony in Rome, and he grows beautiful Echinomastus, Pediocactus, all kinds of rare cacti. And he starts watering at the beginning of January because he wants to provide a little bit of that winter water, even when it's freezing. And then a lot of air circulation and a super fast drying mix. Now, Steve Plath, a lot of advice here, but I'll just summarize. Steve's big motto is be the monsoon. So if you live in an area that has monsoon rains and your plants really depend on that, but you're having a dry season and it's not coming together from the sky, get out there with the hose and get it going that way. And he has some other really good advice here. Shade is really helpful. In cultivation when the plants would not be growing in shade in habitat. It seems to really help quite a bit. And then Mikhail Pillay, who's a PhD student at U of A and owner of Prickly Prospects Nursery, feels that plants are way more flexible in cultivation than you might find their habitat info to be. And so that's an interesting observation, which I mentioned earlier in the presentation, that especially in Southern Arizona, which has a somewhat different or significantly different climate from Phoenix. And then from Central Italy, David Rubo Arezzo, and he uses a lot of habitat data to grow his sclerocacti, and he uses polystyrene around the inside of the pots to thermally insulate the roots, which is very interesting. And you can see this system here in this photo from David, Sclerocactus polyancestris, grown from seed, buried in these little pools of polystyrene to insulate the roots and keep them a little bit cooler. And this is in Italy, and he gets beautiful results. I mean, those are gorgeous roots. You can see that the soil that he uses is quite poor, as befits, the plant. And then Tristan Davis, who's chair of the propagation education group for the Central Arizona Society. Don't force a plant to try to grow somewhere in your yard where it doesn't want to grow. That's some really important advice. You want to really check out what's going on. And then highly diverse with all kinds of different things put in the soil. And then I like Tristan's #1 rule: always obtain 2 of everything if possible. And that gives you a lot of, you can experiment. And I'll tell you, my experience too was that you can really experiment a lot if you're growing from seed. So there's a gorgeous sunset from Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument from one of the nights that I was camping with cacti. And I want to express my thanks to the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State, the Cactus and Succulent Society of San Diego, the Central Arizona Cactus and Succulent Society, and especially the Cactus and Succulent Society of America, because there was a lot of funding from 2014 to 2019 especially, and none of these studies would have been possible otherwise. And that is my presentation.